Effective immediately, Ethan Cole is no longer part of Cole Vantage Development. Mr. Cole, do you have any comment? Cut them loose. Every one of them. Understood. I am already moving. Nobody standing in that crowd, soaked to the collar in a cold Denver rain, knew the truth. This counterstrike had been moving in total silence for 14 months. In just under 6 hours, the entire Ashford family would learn exactly what they had thrown away, and exactly who had been holding the controls the whole time. My name is Ethan Cole. I am 45 years old, and until about 8 months ago, I believed one simple thing. If you build something with your own 2 hands, nobody can ever truly take it from you. I was wrong about the taking part. I turned out to be right about everything else that mattered. On a Tuesday morning in late October, I stood on the wet gray steps of the city and county building in downtown Denver. Rain coming down soft and steady, holding a plain manila folder with my own divorce decree sealed inside it. My wife stood about 12 feet away, smiling for a camera crew I had not invited and had not been told about. Her mother stood beside her, holding a black umbrella the way a queen holds a scepter. Chin high, spine straight, certain of the ending she believed was coming. I noticed one small thing that morning, the kind of detail you file away without understanding why it matters. Eleanor's knuckles were pale where she gripped that umbrella handle, not the loose grip of a woman celebrating a victory. The white grip of someone holding on to something for dear life. Behind the performance she was putting on for the cameras, I caught the smallest flicker of real fear crossing her face. I did not know what to do with that flicker then. I would understand it soon enough. Here is the part that should tell you, this scene was not what it looked like. I was not crying. I was not shouting. I was not begging anyone to reconsider. I had my phone in my hand, and I was about to make one short call to the only person who had stood beside me since the beginning. Before we get into how any of this happened, I want you to sit with something for a moment. Over those 14 months, everything my wife and her family built in order to take from me would end up costing them more than they ever imagined it could, and they would not understand why until it was far too late to stop it. Let me take you back to where this really began. Not the courthouse. Long before the courthouse. It started at 6:30 on an ordinary morning, the kind of soft gray Denver morning, where the light comes up slow over the foothills and the coffee shops on Tennyson Street have not flipped their signs to open yet. I had been awake since 5, the same as I had been for the last 22 years. Ever since I was 19, hauling framing lumber onto job sites before the sun came up, learning the difference between men who talk about building things and men who actually pick up the tools and build them. My son Noah was still asleep down the hall. 12 years old, all elbows and knees and quiet questions he saved up for the car. The kind of kid who watches everything and says almost nothing until it counts. I stood in his doorway for a moment that morning the way I did most mornings, just long enough to hear him breathing steady. His mother, my Rachel, had been gone 7 years by then. Ovarian cancer, fast and merciless when Noah was barely 5. From the day we buried her, it had been the 2 of us against whatever the world decided to send. I was a single father before I ever learned what that word would ask of me. I did not know yet that in 6 hours a judge would sign a piece of paper ending my second marriage. I did not know that the company I had built from a 2-man framing crew into Cole Vantage Development, a firm that had put up towers along the South Platte and turned 4 dead blocks of the old rail yards into a neighborhood people actually wanted to live in, would no longer carry my name on the letterhead by lunch. I want to tell you about the man I was before that morning, because it matters for everything that comes next. I do not raise my voice. I never have. My father used to say that a man who has to yell to be heard has not earned the room yet. I earned mine slow. 1 job site, 1 signed contract, 1 sleepless night at a time. By the time I was 38, Cole Vantage had 40 employees and a name in this city that meant something when it was spoken at a bank or a zoning hearing. My second wife came into my life 5 years after Rachel died. Vivian Ashford. Sharp, polished, quick with numbers, and quicker with a room full of investors. Her mother, Eleanor, brought a peach cobbler to my house the first Sunday I met her, still warm from the oven. and told everyone at my kitchen table that I was exactly the kind of steady, grounded man this family had been missing. I believed her. That was my first mistake, not marrying Vivian, not welcoming Eleanor to my table. My mistake was believing that steady meant safe. 7 years ago, before Vivian, the company nearly went under. A financing deal on the rail yards project collapsed 3 weeks before we were scheduled to break ground, and I had exactly 2 choices in front of me. Walk away from 4 years of work and lay off half my people, or find money that nobody knew I had. My father had left me 80 acres of ranch land in the high country outside Salida, Colorado. Land that had been in our family since my grandfather bought it in 1961 with cash he saved $1 at a time. Back when a man like him buying 80 acres of anything was its own quiet act of defiance against everyone who said he never would. I sold 40 of those acres without telling a single soul. I told everyone the bridge money came from a private investor out of Chicago. I let them believe it. I did not want anyone to look at me and see a man who needed saving. Not my crew, not my banker, not anyone. That land is gone now. My father's land, half of it, sold off to keep other people employed. I have never told that to another living person until right now. And I am only telling you because you need to understand something about me before this story truly begins. I have spent most of my adult life protecting the people I love from ever having to watch me struggle. I told myself that was strength. I am still not entirely sure whether it was strength or just a quieter, more stubborn kind of silence. So there I stood on those courthouse steps in the cold rain, wearing a charcoal suit that used to feel like armor, listening to my wife announce to a small crowd of reporters and 2 of my own former employees that I was finished. Effective immediately, Ethan Cole is no longer part of Cole Vantage Development. The company requires fresh leadership aligned with a new vision. She had already installed her nephew in my chair, a 28-year-old named Preston, who wore his sunglasses indoors, and whose entire construction experience amounted to 1 summer internship he left early. He would last 6 weeks before he walked out on his own. I did not argue with any of it. I did not even look at Vivian for very long. I reached into my jacket, pulled out my phone, and dialed a number I knew by heart without looking. Grace Holloway, my assistant for 11 years, the only person inside that company who had ever seen the real ledgers, the real sacrifices, the real cost of keeping this whole thing standing. She answered on the second ring. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice level and calm even through the rain crackling against the microphone. I kept my eyes fixed on Vivian the entire time I spoke, because I wanted her to watch my mouth move even if she could not hear the words over the reporters. "Cut them loose," I said, "every one of them." Low and even and final, there was the briefest pause on the line. Not surprise, just the stillness of a woman who had been waiting 14 months to hear those exact words. "Understood," Grace said. "I am already moving." I hung up, slid the phone back into my pocket, and said nothing else. Not to the reporters. Not to Vivian. Not to Eleanor, standing there with her knuckles gone white around the handle of that umbrella. Now, if you are wondering how a man who had just been publicly fired from his own company could turn around in the same breath and fire the very people who fired him, then you are asking the exact right question. Because nothing about that courthouse scene was an ending. It was the final domino in a plan that had been falling into place, one silent piece at a time, for 14 months. That evening, I sat in my truck in the gravel drive of the house, up in the foothills, my mother's house, the one she left me when she passed, the one with the wraparound porch my grandfather built, board by board with his own hands. Through the kitchen window, I watched Noah doing his homework at the table, pencil in hand, feet swinging, as if nothing in the whole world had shifted on its axis that day. I whispered a promise into the quiet cab of that truck, more to myself than to him. I am going to keep every piece of what I built, and I am going to hand it to you clean. What Vivian and her mother did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had already made certain of it. Let me take you back 14 months, to the day the numbers first stopped adding up, and to the quiet decision I made in an empty office that would change all of our lives. If you have ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to love you the most, stay with me. This one is for you. We have to go back further first, 6 years, so you can see how patient this family was, and how patient I had to teach myself to become in order to match them. It was a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, the kind of Colorado day where the heat finally lets go, and the aspens up the canyon start turning the color of a struck match. Eleanor Ashford showed up at my door, unannounced, the way she so often did, carrying a foil-wrapped dish of her cobbler, still warm, always warm, as if she timed the drive down from her place so it would arrive exactly at that temperature. I made far too much again, she said, which was the same thing she always said. Even though anyone with eyes could see that one dish does not accidentally happen. She sat at my kitchen table, praised my coffee, asked about Noah and whether he was still swimming competitively, and then, almost as an afterthought folded into the small talk, mentioned that her grandson, Preston, was between opportunities and wondered whether there might be some small place for him at Cole Vantage. Nothing important, she said. Just somewhere the boy could learn the ropes and find his footing. I said I would think about it. I meant it as a polite refusal. Vivian heard the whole exchange from the hallway and came in already smiling, already halfway to yes. Family takes care of family, Ethan, she said, resting her hand on my shoulder as though that gesture settled the matter entirely. It is one summer. What is the harm? She was not wrong that a young person deserves a shot. That is exactly what made it so hard to say no. Preston started in procurement 3 weeks later. I want to be clear about one thing. I have never had a problem giving people a chance. Over the years, I hired men fresh out of prison, high school dropouts, guys twice my age starting life over after a plant closed on them. What I had a problem with was watching invoices come through procurement that did not match the vendors we had trusted for 15 years. Small at first. A few $1,000s here, routed through a supply outfit I had never heard of, tucked into a legitimate order so it looked like nothing. Easy to miss if you were not the kind of man who reads every line. I am exactly that kind of man. I said nothing. Not yet. I have learned the hard way that the moment you speak too early, people simply get better at hiding. 14 months before that rainy morning on the courthouse steps, I sat alone in my office on a Friday night, long after the last truck had rolled out of the lot, working through a stack of quarterly reports with a red pen and a mug of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. 3 consulting invoices refused to reconcile against any actual work anyone in the building could point to. I traced the shell outfit back through 2 filings to a limited liability company registered at Eleanor Ashford's home address in Cherry Hills. I remember exactly what that felt like. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and far heavier. Like standing in a house you built and hearing, somewhere above you in the dark, the slow, steady drip of a leak in a roof you were certain you had sealed. I called Grace into my office that night. She had been with me since the days when the entire company fit inside one job trailer with a space heater and a coffee maker that shorted out if you ran both at once. She had watched me build this thing from nothing. More than that, she was the only person besides my late mother who ever truly understood what it had cost me to do it. I need you to start keeping records, I told her quietly. Real timesheets, real invoices. Everything dated, everything scanned. Everything backed up in 2 places that have nothing to do with the company servers. She did not ask me why. She just looked at me for a moment and asked how far back I wanted her to go. As far as it takes, I said. What Grace and I built over the following year was not revenge. Not at the start. It was documentation. A plain blue notebook kept entirely off the company network, cross-referencing every inflated invoice against the real market price of the work. Printed copies of internal emails, some of them pulled back from the dead after being deleted, showing conversations between Vivian and Preston about how the org chart would be restructured once the divorce was finalized. A paper trail 4 inches thick, sitting in a fireproof lockbox inside a storage unit off Santa Fe Drive that not one member of the Ashford family knew existed. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with preparing for a war that nobody around you knows is being fought. I carried it to Noah's swim meets. I carried it to parent-teacher conferences. I carried it to the grocery store and to the gas station and into my own bed at night. I want to tell you about one particular night from that stretch, because I think about it more than almost anything else. 4 years back, before the invoices, before I had noticed anything wrong at all, the company hit a cash crunch on a project that would have put 50 of our people out of work if it collapsed. I made a decision I never breathed a word of to anyone. I quietly took out a second mortgage on the Foothills house, my mother's house, the only thing of hers I had left in this world, and I used it to bridge the gap until the next draw cleared. That same season, I married Vivian, believing partnership meant something sturdier than it would turn out to mean. And that very same week, years later, she was in Aspen at a gala thrown by her mother's circle, being toasted as one of the women reshaping the Denver skyline, celebrated in a room full of first-class flights and valet stands lined with cars, worth more than the homes my crews grew up in. I was home with Noah, eating reheated pasta, watching the mortgage paperwork dry on the counter, telling myself I would explain all of it to her eventually. I never found the right moment. Maybe I never really looked for one. I think some part of me already understood, even then, that the version of our marriage where I was allowed to be tired, allowed to need help, allowed to be anything at all other than steady, that version had quietly stopped existing. So I stopped offering that version of myself up to be judged. I just kept building, and I kept quiet. 10 months before the courthouse, everything accelerated. I found a signed strategic partnership agreement with an outside investment group, a document that promised to sell off a controlling share of company stock, using a power of attorney with my signature at the bottom of it. My signature. One I had never once put on that page. There was something else in that same drawer that week, tucked beneath the folder in the home office Vivian and I used to share. A rubber stamp bearing an exact replica of my signature, the kind of stamp people use for high-volume paperwork. I had never ordered it. I never asked out loud who had. That stamp, I would later learn, had already appeared on 3 documents I had never laid eyes on. Months before I even knew to go looking. I sat with that forged agreement for a long time. Forgery is not a small word. It is not a misunderstanding you talk through gently over dinner. It is a choice a person makes on purpose, believing you will never look closely enough to catch them. That night, I drove out to a turnout above Chatfield Reservoir, killed the engine, and sat in the dark until nearly 1 in the morning. I thought about my son asleep at home. I thought about my father's land, half of it already gone. I thought about my mother's house, the porch swing, that has creaked in the exact same spot since before I could walk, and how easily a stranger with a stamp could decide to sell it out from under a boy who had already lost one parent. I made a promise that night out loud to no one in particular. It had nothing to do with buildings or stock or contracts. Whatever I have given up to keep this family standing, I said to the empty dark, I will not let them walk off with it as though it were ever theirs to spend. When I got home that night, I stood over Noah's sneakers by the door. Laces still knotted the way he always left them, because he was too impatient to untie them. I loosened them anyway, a small, quiet ritual for a promise I had not yet said aloud to him. That is the night I stopped being a man waiting for things to get better on their own, and became a man building a case. Every week after that brought another piece, another invoice that led nowhere honest, another email thread, another quiet confirmation that this had never once been about family. It had been about access, and I had handed all of it over freely, because I still believed the word family meant something to the people who used it as often as the Ashfords did. I was about to find out precisely how far they were willing to go, and precisely how much I still had not discovered. Stay with that question for a second. Was 14 months of silence patience, or was it a mistake that let them go too far? I went back and forth on it 1,000 times. I still do. I want to tell you about Rachel, because you cannot understand why I fought the way I fought, unless you understand the woman who taught me what a home is worth. She grew up 2 counties over from my grandfather's ranch, the daughter of a school teacher, and she had a way of walking into a room full of loud men and going quiet until every one of them leaned in to hear her. We were married 11 years. When the doctor said the word ovarian, she was the calm one. She made lists. She organized Noah's kindergarten paperwork 3 years ahead. She wrote me instructions for how to braid nothing, because we had a boy. but she wrote me instructions for everything else in a spiral notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer. How to talk to a teacher who is wrong without making an enemy. How to tell when Noah is scared and pretending he is not. When to let him win and when to let him lose. The last real conversation we had, she was down to 90 pounds, and she still made me sit to the foot of the bed and promise her 2 things. The first was that I would not turn into a ghost that worked itself to death, so it would not have to feel anything. I broke that promise for a while. The second was that I would never let anyone convince Noah that his worth was a thing other people got to measure and hand back to him. I kept that one. I kept it in that boardroom without even realizing that was what I was doing. Here is the part I have never said out loud. The reason I could not stand the idea of Vivian seeing me struggle was not really about Vivian at all. It was that Rachel had seen me struggle. Seen me broke and scared and covered in drywall dust with $40 in the account, and she had never once looked at me like I was less of a man for it. Nobody had ever done that before or since. Somewhere in my head I had decided that kind of grace only came around once, and that if I ever showed the next person the raw underside of me, they would do what I had always feared people would do. They would use it. Turns out I was not entirely wrong. That is the sad part. That is also the part that is on me. There was one night, about halfway through the 14 months, that I think about more than the courthouse and more than the boardroom. It was 2 a.m. and I was in the storage unit off Santa Fe Drive with a cheap clip lamp and the fireproof box open on a folding table, matching a stack of vendor quotes against Eleanor's shell invoices line by line. Grace was there, too, sleeves pushed up, reading serial numbers off delivery tickets in a flat whisper so we would not lose our place. Noah was at a friend's house for a sleepover, which was the only reason I could be there at all. Somewhere around the 9th invoice, I found the number that made it undeniable. $41,000 for site security on a project that had used our own 2 guys and a dog. I did not say anything for a long moment. I just set the paper down on the table and pressed my palms flat against it, the way you press against something to make sure it is really there. Grace looked at me and did not say it is going to be okay, because she does not say things she cannot guarantee. She just said, "We have it now, we have all of it." And she was right. That was the night the fear finally turned into something with edges I could hold. I drove home from that storage unit as the sky was going gray, and I stopped in the doorway of Noah's empty room out of pure habit, listening for breathing that was not there because he was across town in a sleeping bag. I stood there anyway. A single father learns to check on his kid even when the room is empty, because the checking is really you reminding yourself who you are doing all of it for. I was doing it for him. Not for the company, not for my name on a wall, for a 12-year-old who had already buried one parent and did not need to watch the other one get quietly robbed of everything he had promised to leave behind. 2 days after the courthouse, with rain still coming down steady over the front range, Eleanor Ashford showed up at my front door carrying a foil dish of cobbler, the same as always, and an apology I had never asked her for. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something that matters. Vivian's announcement on those courthouse steps had been staged for cameras, but it had never actually gone through the board. She held the title of chief executive. She did not hold the unilateral authority to remove a sitting chairman without a vote. I had spent those first 2 days quietly confirming exactly that with the company's outside counsel not reacting, not tipping my hand, just making absolutely sure the ground I was about to stand on would hold my weight. I almost did not answer the door that Thursday evening. I am glad I did, because what happened in the next 20 minutes told me more than 14 months of invoices ever had. She stood on my porch, her umbrella dripping onto the welcome mat, mascara smudged just slightly at the corners of her eyes. Whether that was the rain or something real, I honestly could not tell you, even now. "Ethan, honey, I know things have been so hard," she said, the words coming out soft and rehearsed. "I am not here to fight with you. I just need you to reactivate the operating accounts before the end of the month. There is a loan coming due, and it is collateralized against revenue from a few of the consulting entities. If those accounts stay frozen, it is going to become a very real problem for everyone. Standing there in the doorway, I understood that my wife had almost certainly known about this visit before Eleanor ever raised her hand to knock. Nothing in that family moved without Vivian signing off on it first. Not anymore. Maybe not ever. The rain tapped steady against the porch roof, a sound I had loved my whole life until that night. I watched a single bead of water slide off the edge of her umbrella and land on the polished toe of her shoe. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence pulling tight between us like a rope about to reach the end of its slack. My jaw tightened, but I kept my hands loose and open at my sides, a trick I had learned years ago on job sites, back when losing your temper cost more than it ever bought you. I let her keep talking. That is a skill, letting a person keep talking. People reveal more in the silence they mistake for you softening than they ever do when you are pushing back. Once this all settles, she went on, encouraged by my quiet. Vivian is going to liquidate some of the company's holdings, and everybody walks away clean. It does not have to turn ugly, Ethan. We are still family. Then she said the sentence I will carry with me for the rest of my life, delivered with a little laugh, as though she were letting me in on a joke I should have understood years ago. You were never the brains of this operation, sweetheart. You were the muscle. Somebody has to hold the hammer, while smarter people hold the plans. Standing in that doorway, I understood that Eleanor was not really there to ask me for money. She was there to ask me to stay small. A woman who raised 2 children alone on a school cafeteria salary learns early that control is the one insurance policy nobody can ever repossess. Somewhere along the decades, keeping her daughter's household under her own quiet authority had become the last living proof that the frightened young widow she had once been would never have to be powerless again. Calling me the muscle was not cruelty for its own sake. It was fear, wearing the costume of confidence. The same fear that had driven every padded invoice, every forged signature, every warm dish of cobbler, pressed into my hands like a peace offering that was never actually about peace. I want you to understand what that moment truly was, because on the surface, it sounds like nothing more than an insult. It was not. It was a confession. She had just told me, without meaning to, that this family had never once seen me as a partner. I was labor. Convenient, reliable, disposable labor, and in that same breath, something else surfaced in me. A memory from 3 years earlier that I had not let myself hold in a long time. Vivian had come down with a fever the night before the most important pitch of her career. A partnership presentation to a group of investors that would define the next 5 years of the company. I stayed up until 4 in the morning finishing her slides and rehearsing her talking points out loud in an empty conference room so that she could sleep. The next morning I sat in a folding chair at the back of that boardroom while she stood at the head of the table and took every ounce of the credit, glowing under the recessed lights, thanking her own vision and her own instincts without once glancing in my direction. I applauded anyway. I told myself it did not matter who got the credit as long as the company survived. I told myself that particular lie a great many times over the years. Standing on my porch, listening to Eleanor call me the muscle, I finally understood what all of those nights had actually cost me. Not money, recognition, the plain human decency of being seen. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my jacket pocket and quietly switched on a small recorder Grace had handed me weeks earlier, pressed flat against my chest. You keep calling it family, I said, but you are trying to take my mother's house. Eleanor's face shifted, just slightly. Just enough. Nobody is taking anything that is not already half gone, Ethan, she said. You signed papers. You made your choices. I signed a mortgage to save this company, I told her. I never once signed my mother's house over to a stranger's investment fund. She had no answer for that. She simply picked her umbrella back up, told me to think it over, and walked back to her car, leaving the cobbler on my porch table to go cold in the rain. 5 days after the courthouse, I called an emergency meeting of the board, not to fight, to finish what 14 months of quiet work had prepared me to finish. The boardroom on the 12th floor of our downtown offices has windows that run from floor to ceiling, looking out over the whole grid of the city toward the mountains. That view used to make me proud every single time I walked in. That morning the sky hung low and gray, rain streaking the glass, and the room felt colder than the thermostat could explain. Vivian sat at the head of the table in a cream-colored suit, her jaw set tight. Her phone gripped in one hand like it might hold her upright. Eleanor sat beside her, that familiar warmth stretched thin over something closer to dread now. Preston lounged 2 seats down, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, still wearing the easy confidence of a young man who assumed this meeting would go exactly the way the courthouse announcement had. I walked in 5 minutes late. I did not sit in the chairman's seat. Vivian had already handed that chair to Preston, though the board had never once voted to put him in it. I stood at the back of the room instead, with Grace beside me, holding a thin folder and a single flash drive. Vivian opened the meeting the way she had clearly rehearsed. Today we will be formalizing the leadership transition and finalizing the removal of legacy roles that no longer serve the direction of this company. Before we vote on anything, I said, my voice even, carrying easily across that quiet room, I think everyone in here should see a few documents first. Grace stepped forward and plugged in the drive. The screen at the front of the room filled with the first image. Real-time sheets from our field crews, laid side by side against the official payroll records. Records that had been quietly padded for 2 full years through Eleanor's shell entities. Then came the inflated invoices. Dozens of them, all routed through the same small handful of consulting companies. Every one of them traceable to addresses connected to the Ashford family. Then the deleted emails Grace had recovered, conversations between Vivian and Preston from 8 months earlier, laying out timelines for phasing me out once the divorce filing went through. And then the document that made the entire room go silent. A scanned copy of the second mortgage on the Foothills house, dated 4 years back, my own real signature at the bottom of it. Beside it, a second document. A proposed sale of that very same property to an outside buyer, my signature forged onto a power of attorney I had never in my life authorized. I looked directly at Vivian. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. That house belonged to my mother, I said. I mortgaged it 4 years ago to save this company. The same week you were in Aspen, being celebrated by your mother's friends. I never told you because I could not stand the idea of you looking at me as a man who needed help. And now you are trying to sell it out from under my son, without so much as my real signature on the sale. For the first time in all the years I had known her, Vivian had absolutely nothing to say. Then Walter Boyd, the company accountant, a man Vivian trusted without reservation, a man I had quietly pulled aside and asked to help Grace and me nearly 2 years earlier, stood up on his own. Everything on that screen is accurate, he said, his voice steady, even as his hands trembled at his sides. I have been documenting the discrepancy since Mr. Cole first asked me to look into the procurement irregularities. It is all here, and it all reconciles. Eleanor's composure cracked in a way I had never once seen it crack. Ethan, we can fix this quietly, she said, half rising from her chair. We can still. You had 14 months to fix it quietly, I said. You chose to fire me on the courthouse steps, in front of cameras, instead. The room stayed silent for a long moment after Walter sat back down. The kind of silence that has actual weight to it, that presses on your chest. Vivian tried once more, her voice smaller now, stripped of the boardroom polish she wore like armor. Ethan, you cannot do this to me. We had a family. Whatever went wrong, we had something real once. Looking at her in that moment, I finally understood something about my wife that 14 years, no, that our whole marriage had never taught me as clearly as 14 minutes of watching her lose everything did. Vivian had never actually learned how to want to be loved. She had only ever learned how to want to be undefeated. Somewhere between her mother's lean years and her own steep climb, being right had quietly replaced being close as the thing that made her feel safe in the world. She was not lying when she said we had once had something real. She simply could no longer tell the difference between being married to me and being ahead of me. That confusion, I think, was the true inheritance Eleanor had passed down. Not a house, not a company. The belief that any love you cannot fully control is not a love you can afford to trust. I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. I want to be honest with you. Some part of me still remembered the woman who used to fall asleep against my shoulder on long flights, who used to leave little notes tucked into Noah's lunchbox in the early days before any of this money existed. That woman was somewhere in that room, buried under years of ambition and other people's whispered permission. I let myself grieve her quietly for exactly one breath. Then I answered the woman who was actually standing in front of me. "We did have something real," I said. "You are the one who chose to end it by bringing your family in to take what was never theirs to touch. I am not doing anything to you, Vivian. I am taking back what belongs to me and to my son." The board did not need long to deliberate. 11 minutes by my watch, 11 minutes to unwind 14 months of quiet infiltration. The vote was very nearly unanimous. Preston was removed from his position on the spot, along with 2 other Ashford family hires who had been placed in finance and procurement over the previous 2 years. Vivian was stripped of her chief executive title, effective that afternoon, pending a full internal audit and a referral to the company's outside counsel regarding the forged power of attorney. I was reinstated as chairman, a role I had never legitimately lost since the board had never actually voted to remove me in the first place. The majority ownership stake I had structured years earlier, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of quiet takeover, meant the outcome had never truly been in doubt once the truth was up on the screen. Vivian and Eleanor were asked to vacate the building within 24 hours. I want to tell you what that moment actually felt like, because it was nothing at all like what you would expect. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired, the specific, bone-deep tiredness that comes from carrying something impossibly heavy for a very long time, and finally, at last, being allowed to set it down. I walked to the window and looked out over the city, the rain still falling in the same steady rhythm it had kept all morning. Behind me, I heard Eleanor's composure finally break all the way through, not into anger, into something quieter and much sadder. A muttering, half to herself. All of this over a few contracts. A few contracts, as if the scale of what she had tried to take could somehow be shrunk by saying it small enough. Grace stepped up beside me at the window, careful to keep the professional distance she always kept, present without ever intruding. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. "I am all right," I said. "Just tired. Tired from a lot of years of staying quiet." She did not try to fill the silence with something reassuring. She just stood there with me and let it be exactly what it was. I need to pause the story here and tell you about something that happened 3 years before that boardroom, because I think it explains why that phrase, "a few contracts," cut me as deeply as it did. There was a stretch back then when the company was scaling fast, and I was working 18-hour days just to keep the wheels from coming off. Noah was 9. He had a school play, a small production about the water cycle, the kind of thing that feels enormous when you are 9 and forgettable when you are an adult, except it is never actually forgettable. Not really. I told myself I would catch the second half after wrapping a site inspection. The inspection ran long, the way they always do. I reached the school gymnasium just as the lights came up, and the other parents were filing out, holding grocery store bouquets for their kids. Noah was standing near the edge of the stage in a little cardboard cloud costume, scanning the emptying crowd, and I watched his face do the thing a child's face does when he is trying very hard not to look disappointed in front of his friends. I never told him what that moment cost me. I never told anyone. I just carried it the way I carried most things, quietly and alone, filed away beside every other Saturday I had spent on a job site instead of at home. Every anniversary I had half remembered because a deadline ate the week. Every ounce of myself I had poured into building something I truly believed we were building together. Standing at that boardroom window, listening to Eleanor mutter about a few contracts, I understood something I had never let myself fully see. None of my sacrifices had ever really been seen by these people. They had been used. That is a very different thing from being valued. By early evening, the transition was already in motion. Security walked Preston out with a single cardboard box, mostly sneakers he had kept under his desk, and a framed photo of himself at a company event he had attended for all of 3 weeks. He did not say a word on his way out, just adjusted his sunglasses, even though the sun had long since disappeared behind the clouds. Vivian stopped at the elevator bank, and for one moment I thought she might turn around. She did not. The doors closed on her reflection in the polished steel, a woman I had built a life with, standing very small in a very large lobby she used to cross, as though she owned every inch of the floor. Eleanor lingered the longest, gathering a few things from a desk drawer she had claimed as her own over the last 2 years. Watching her move slower than everyone else toward the door, I found myself thinking, against my own will, about something Vivian had told me once. That her mother had been widowed at 31, raising 2 children alone on a cafeteria worker's wages, and had sworn to herself that her family would never again depend on anyone else's mercy. It did not excuse a single thing she had done, but it helped me understand the hunger underneath it, and that understanding made it just possible to let her walk out without hating her for the rest of my life. That night, I drove up to the Foothills house instead of my apartment in the city. I sat on the porch, the one my grandfather built, the one that still creaks in the exact same spot it always has, and I let myself feel something I had not allowed in 14 months. Relief. Thin and quiet, settling over me like the cool of the evening air coming down off the mountain. The morning after the vote, I sat alone in the chairman's office. My office again. The city waking up slow through the glass, streetlights still glowing faint against the paling sky. On the desk in front of me sat the signed transfer of control, the ink barely dry, the culmination of 14 months I had carried almost entirely by myself. Grace knocked once and let herself in, setting down a black coffee and a thin folder without a word. That was one of the things I valued most about her. She never needed a moment explained to her. She simply showed up exactly the way the moment required. "They finished moving out," she said. "Preston and the other 2. Eleanor called this morning. She wants to see you one last time." I thought about it for exactly as long as it took to drink 1 sip of coffee. "No," I said. "I do not need to see her again. I just need them gone." There was no anger in it, only clarity. Some doors close not because you are punishing whoever stands on the other side, but because you are simply, finally, done with what was behind them. Grace told me later that she had watched Eleanor leave the building, for the last time that afternoon, from the lobby window. While she finished the final paperwork, Eleanor walked out carrying that same dish of cobbler, still untouched, the foil beginning to curl at the edges. She stood under the awning for a long moment, looking up at the company sign, the one she used to point out to her friends at church, telling them, "That is my daughter's company." Then she turned and got into the back of a plain sedan her driver had brought around. Nothing like the town cars that used to be arranged for her through Vivian's office. Grace said, Eleanor never once looked back. I did not feel satisfaction hearing that secondhand. I felt something closer to grief, for the version of family I had once genuinely hoped that woman believed in. That evening I drove up to the Foothills, earlier than usual. Noah was sitting on the front steps waiting for me, backpack still on his shoulders, the porch light not yet switched on behind him. He had clearly been there a while. I parked, climbed out, loosened my tie, and sat down beside him on the same steps I used to sit on as a boy myself, waiting for my own father to come home from a job site with sawdust still in the creases of his hands. "Dad," he said, "is Mom okay?" I thought carefully before I answered. Noah deserved the truth, but he also deserved a truth a 12-year-old could actually carry. "Your mom is going to be okay," I said. "She has some hard things to work through, but she is going to be okay. From here on out, she and I are going to live in 2 different places. And I am going to do everything I possibly can to make sure you still have both of us, all the way, for your whole life." He nodded slowly, the way kids do when they are absorbing something bigger than they have words for yet. I put my arm around his shoulders and looked up at the house behind us, the one my mother left me, the one my grandfather built board by board, the one that had very nearly slipped through my fingers because I trusted the wrong people with the truth of how hard I had fought to keep it. The porch swing creaking its same old rhythm behind us, I thought of my father teaching me to swing a hammer on this exact patch of grass, his hand wrapped over mine, correcting my grip without a single word of frustration. "Slow is smooth," he used to say, "and smooth is what lasts." I had not thought of that phrase in years. Sitting there with Noah's shoulder warm against my side, I understood, maybe for the first time, that I had been living by it the entire 14 months, without realizing I was doing it. I kept my promise, I said, mostly to myself, and partly to him. In the days that followed, I put my energy into something other than the wreckage. I put it into repair. I signed the formal terminations for every member of the Ashford family who had been planted inside the company, all of it clean, documented, defensible in any court in Colorado. But I also went the other direction, deliberately. I found Carol Simmons, a woman who had worked in our accounting department for 11 years, quietly passed over for promotion after promotion, her hours trimmed every time a budget needed adjusting under Vivian's leadership. I moved her into a senior role she had earned 3 times over. I found 2 field supervisors who had been underpaid relative to their years of service, and I corrected their pay retroactively, going back as far as the records allowed. There was no press conference, no public statement calling anyone out by name. I had Grace draft a short, professional release for the local business outlets. Cole Vantage Development reaffirms its commitment to transparency and fair leadership, following an internal governance review. That was all it needed to say. The people who mattered already knew the truth. The people who did not need a spectacle. That is a lesson I had to learn slowly, over many years of being underestimated. Real justice almost never looks the way it looks in the movies. It does not arrive with a courtroom gasp or a dramatic reveal set to swelling music. Most of the time it just looks like paperwork done correctly, and people who lied finally having to sit with what the truth costs. That first week I slept better than I had in over a year. Not because everything was resolved. The divorce still had months left to run, and there would be legal follow-up on the forged documents for a good while yet. I slept better because for the first time in a long time I was not carrying a secret. Everyone who needed to know finally knew. 3 months later, on a Saturday afternoon in a park along the creek, I spread an old checkered blanket under a stand of cottonwoods near the water. The kind of late spring Colorado afternoon where the air smells like cut grass and somebody's charcoal grill 3 tables over. Noah ran off almost immediately to throw a ball for a neighbor's dog, laughing in that loose, unguarded way that only kids and people who have truly set something heavy down can manage. Grace sat across from me, on the blanket unpacking a container of pasta salad and a jar of the lemonade she made from scratch, the way she had done at company gatherings for years, without anyone quite noticing how much thought she put into the small things. I watched my son chase that dog across the grass for a while before I said the thing I had been meaning to say for weeks. "Thank you," I told her. "Not just for the last 14 months. For being here today." She smiled, the same steady smile she had worn through boardrooms and blue notebooks and late nights that neither of us ever talked about outside the office. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "I did what a loyal assistant should do, and I hope what a friend does." I let that settle in the air between us, warm and uncomplicated, without needing to turn it into anything more than it was that day. Some things do not need to be rushed. I had learned that one the hard way. A little later, Noah flopped down on the blanket beside me, out of breath, grass stains already working into the knees of his jeans. "Dad," he said, "how come you are not angry at Mom? How come you never say bad things about her to me?" I had thought about how to answer that question for a long time, honestly, long before he ever asked it. I took a moment to get it right. "Because being angry does not build anything, son," I said. I was angry for a while. I was hurt for a lot longer than I probably let myself admit. But if I had spent all my energy hating your mom, I would not have had anything left over to love you, or to rebuild the company, or to keep the promise I made about this land and this house. So I chose something different. I chose to protect what mattered by staying quiet, gathering what was true, and acting only when it actually counted. He nodded slowly, the way he does when something is settling into him for keeps. "That sounds like it was hard," he said. "It was," I told him. "It still is, some days. But it is a whole lot easier than carrying hate around for the rest of your life." That evening, after Grace and Noah had both headed home, I stood alone on the porch of the Foothills house as the sun dropped low behind the mountains, gold light settling across the yard the same way it had my whole childhood. I thought about how many nights I had stood on porches like this one, waiting for financing to clear, waiting for a phone call, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see what I had been carrying. This time, standing there, I was not waiting for anything at all. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was simply present, and that, it turned out, was its own kind of arrival. Here is what all of it finally taught me. Legacy was never about the size of the company or the number written on a settlement. It is the version of yourself you can still recognize in the mirror. Once everyone who claimed to love you has finished telling you who to be instead. If someone in your own family ever uses the word family to ask you for something that costs you far more than it will ever cost them, do not answer that same day. Write it down on an index card. Set it beside the sugar bowl on the counter. Sleep on it. Read it back to yourself once, out loud, before your coffee the next morning. If it still sounds like love in the daylight, say yes. If it sounds like a bill wearing love's clothing, then say no. Kindly, plainly, and only once. That is not coldness. That is the same quiet arithmetic that kept my son's inheritance safe. Board vote by board vote. Invoice by invoice. Silence by patient silence. Dignity is not a privilege handed down to you by the people who hold the plans. It is a right you carry in your own two hands, the same hands that built the thing they tried to take. Hold on to it. It lasts longer than they ever think it will.